It is a pleasure for me to have with us today Kay Rubacek. She is an author, she is a film director, and she has written a book that I found very intriguing. And it's also a film called Who Are China's Walking Dead?
I didn't realize how censored and how in a bubble the Chinese people are. There's this concept of two layers of skin, and it's where your outer layer does not reflect the inner layer. So the inner layer is the truth. There is truth, but on the surface you have to project something that is not truth, and you have to justify it. The Chinese Communist Party will say, we no longer have slave labor prison camps. Our detention centers are all being shut down. So they will write that in their articles, but internally they change the names and they call them drug rehabilitation centers. They're run by the same people. They're the same facilities. They carry out the same tasks. And you tell everybody it's something new and you expect them to buy it. When they told me in China, I said, why did you arrest me? The police said, well, what you did was illegal. And I said, truth, compassion, tolerance is illegal? They said, yes, it's illegal in China.
Welcome to another episode of Ideas Have Consequences with me, Larry Alex Taunton, and it is a pleasure for me to have with us today Kay Rubacek. She is an author, she is a film director, and she has written a book that I found very intriguing, and it's also a film called Who Are China's Walking Dead? Kay joins us from New York. How are you, Kay?
I am really well, thanks, Larry. Thank you for having me on.
Well, I was very intrigued by your book. It was recommended to me, maybe even by someone on social media. I'm not sure. But regardless, I started digging into that book. I'm listening to the mellifluous tones of your voice as you're reading the audio version of that book. And it really is a fascinating insight into how modern China works and into the mindset of the Chinese Communist Party. And it seems to me that a logical place to begin would be a little bit with your family of origin, because your parents have an interesting background as well. Tell us a little bit about them and about yourself.
Sure. You know, it's funny that I actually found out so much of this, or I really connected the dots as I was putting the book together, because my family history wasn't something that my family really talked about, because they found freedom. They escaped communism actually from 3 different communist regimes. My family escaped communism first, great-grandparents in Russia, when the Soviets came and took over, and their lives were in great danger. They were lucky to survive and escape. And my father was actually born and raised in China as a young Russian boy, because that's where they were able to find some freedom at the time. But then the Chinese Communist Party took over. And when my father was 14, and in China there was what they call the Great Famine, which is a heavy euphemism for a regime-caused famine that killed apparently 45 million people, a lot of people, 45 million people. That was when my father and his family escaped to Australia. My mother's family had left a little bit earlier. And so they met and married in Australia years later. And they didn't really talk about communism, because in Australia we felt it was very far away, and we felt very comfortable and very blessed to be able to have freedom of religion, freedom of speech. And so my family growing up never really talked about that, except my grandmother gave me a few hints. Now, the third part of my family of escaping communism is the former Czechoslovakia. That's where my husband was born and raised, and his family had to escape there, not because of religious reasons. My family mostly escaped Russia because they were believers and had faith and didn't want to die for that. But my husband's family, they were atheists, but they weren't following the political line. They saw what communism did, and so because my husband's grandfather was quite high up in the party, they got themselves into political trouble. So basically, they had to leave, or they would have been in prison. So that's sort of three run-ins with the Communist Party in one family. I myself spent a day in a Chinese prison for being a human rights advocate. I held a banner on Tiananmen Square That's it. I broke 0 laws, no laws at all, but they arrested me for holding the word compassion in a public space, which is a major taboo in China. But I needed to see it for myself, and I did. So all of these kind of background stories I dug into more deeply during writing of this book, because I felt if I could bring in how I came to understand the people I was interviewing, these Chinese Communist Party officials, how to understand their way of thinking, because it's just so different to us. I thought if I put my story in there, then maybe more Americans could see themselves through my story as someone who's trying to understand how communism could create the mentality that people can act out such really vicious and evil crimes. And that's what my book is about, trying to understand the mentality of that and what brings people, human beings, to do such horrible things to each other.
Kay, was this something you were interested in early in life, or was it such that you grew up in a free society and, a typical teenager, say, isn't necessarily that interested in, hearing stories of their parents' childhood or past, and this was something that maybe you became much more interested in later, or were you always interested in it? I mean, what led you to do this? Was it academic background? What led you on this personal journey?
Well, my academic background is actually in art. I started in as an artist. I was studying fine arts at college in Australia, um, but there was a problem. I found a problem, um, and I couldn't name it at the time. Now, when I look back, it's the socialist indoctrination and the forcing of me to do conceptual art. I was not being taught traditional art. I was not being taught how to paint. I wanted to learn how to paint. I could draw. I could do a lot of things well enough, but I wasn't able to get to the level that I wanted to get to. And they weren't allowing me to do that. They were forcing me to do contemporary art, which was something that I saw my friends and colleagues at school and even mature age students. They were gaining this. Some of them were doing these beautiful paintings and they were all failing. Meanwhile, I'm tying together miles and miles of fishing line and creating these ridiculous sculptures, and I'm getting high distinctions. There was a problem. So it was only later that I came back around to seeing and studying the communist roots behind a lot of the institutions, especially educational institutions here in America and Australia and around the world. But I guess what brought me to wanting to dig into this, I was always really close with my grandmother. She didn't speak much English. I tried to learn Russian. I learned Russian to be able to speak with her, and I would go to church with her every weekend. And so I was just a very pious kid, and I was always very much like that. But then I had my time coming full circle and questioning things. And so I guess I've always been interested in the meaning of life, the purpose of life, philosophy. I'm no professional psychologist, but I love understanding people and really giving people the benefit of the doubt, but understanding how they tick, because we're all so different. And I found that so miraculous and fascinating. And I think my faith ties into that. So all of these things kind of came together. And then when I saw the crimes in modern day time and how many people communism has killed in our modern history, there's no other greater killer than communism in modern history. Then when I saw my family connections to that, I thought I felt a responsibility. I felt a responsibility that no matter what difference I can make, I don't want. I have 2 kids, right? I have 2 kids. Well, they're almost both adults now. But if the concentration camps in China are going to open up. I really believe that, because they have in every regime over time, and the truth has come out. And I just thought my personal experience and knowing what my grandparents, great grandparents lived through, and the strength of courage and character that they had, I thought I need to use that, learn from them. And I don't want in the future, when the camps open up, for my kids or my grandkids to look at me and say, "You knew. What did you do?" And or why didn't you do something? I didn't want that question. So I think that's really what has been a driver for me. I've been a professional producer in multimedia since I left college, basically, more than 25 years ago, and so I use those skills and wherever I have the opportunity to kind of bring these stories out, because I know those camps are going to open up in the future, and we will see the atrocities that have happened, but then it's too late. So I have a responsibility now. That's why I'm doing this.
I believe it's your grandmother, as I recall from the book, who told you as a child that you are never to use the names of Mao or Lenin or maybe Stalin was thrown into the mix positively within your household. Tell us a little bit about that.
She even wouldn't let me wear a red dress, and oh, heaven forbid I want a red car in the future. That would be the biggest taboo. She just had this. I think a lot of my family just thought it was superstition because she was such a believer, such a religious believer, and they saw it as superstitious that she didn't want bright red. You know, the real the communist red. There's the Chinese Communist Party, the Soviet red they have the same color red, and she wouldn't let us wear that kind of red. And it was kind of funny because I was doing Russian dancing we had a strong Russian community, and I was part of that. And we had these red shoes, and I was always a bit nervous that my grandma would say, "No, I don't want you wearing those red shoes." But they were a slightly different color tone, and they were so pre-Soviet. So that was the pre-Soviet Russian. And I really grew up in the community of a family that only knew the pre-Soviet Russian traditions. And they're really beautiful. I played in a Russian folk orchestra for many years. I did Russian dancing. I spoke the language. It was so wonderful. The food, my goodness, amazing. So all of these things were pre-Soviet times. When you see how things have changed, it's a very different culture now, and it's not what we say, as in Russian today is not the same Russian that it was during my family's time. So that's really coming to terms with that. What my grandmother saw as mentioning Stalin, she equated that red color with Stalin and Mao, and I just knew the color as a kid. I'm like, okay, no, don't do that because grandma's not going to like that. Don't buy that bag. Don't get that jewelry or something like that. So yeah, we kind of just put it down to superstition and faith. But when I look back, it was, I think there's trauma for sure. There is trauma with the association, and people that I've interviewed, survivors from Chinese communism and other communist regimes, they have those associations where there's been forced indoctrination, and they have, whether it's a color or there's a woman who told me, she was translating for me in one of my interviews. She left communist China at least 20, 30 years prior to that interview. And she came out visibly shaken. She was in a separate room translating for me through an earpiece. And she came out in the break visibly shaken, and she said, I only realize now, decades after I left China, that when I hear the words in Chinese, Gongchangdang, Chinese Communist Party, I feel a warmth in my heart that is the same as the love for my mother. And she said, I hate that so much. But she said, I didn't realize that I had that in me, and I didn't realize that I hated that feeling. But how can you hate that feeling? Because that's the same feeling that you have for your parents. But that's what is instilled in even kindergartens today in China, that the love for the party is above the love for your family, for your parents, for your grandmother, certainly. And there's a lot of associations tied to it, whether it's a red scarf or some other insignia. And that is often connected to trauma that these survivors have and that they need to work through once they come to a free society. So that's a lot of the people that I have interviewed are dealing with this trauma and recovery processes in their own ways. But I find it not only really fascinating, but very insightful to learn from them. And that's really why I wanted to put that into a book, because as horrific as their experiences are, I feel that it's necessary to understand what they've been through to understand how far they've come in terms of recovery and adjusting to what we call generally a free society. So I find that really inspiring and fascinating.
There's peace of mind in security, security for our country, security for our leaders, and security for our families. But think about this. You're not financially secure if all your eggs are in one basket. Gold and silver are an excellent way to diversify your savings. They're a hedge against inflation. They're a physical asset that is in high demand globally, from the wealthy to central banks. And through my friends at Birch Gold Group, you can own physical gold and silver in a tax-sheltered retirement account. That's right, you can diversify an old IRA or 401k for no money out of pocket into an IRA in gold and silver. This is one thing you can do to secure your family's savings. Text IDEAS to 989898 and receive a free, no-obligation Infokit, and learn the role precious metals play in your overall savings strategy. Again, text IDEAS to 989898. With an A-plus rating with the Better Business Bureau and thousands of happy customers, you can trust Birch Gold like I do. Text IDEAS to 989898. This is from CBS News. And Kay, if I'm asking you a question or taking you somewhere politically that you don't want to go, that's quite all right. But I was fascinated with this because I just happened to read this while I'm reading your book about Tiananmen Square. Again, I'm reading from CBS News. As of 2016, Tim Walz has visited China about 30 times, including for his honeymoon. Walz married wife Gwen, a fellow teacher, on June 4, 1994, the 5th anniversary of China's brutal repression of Tiananmen Square protests. He wanted to have a date he'll always remember, she told the Star Herald before they wed.
Yeah, I know.
I was blown away by this.
Wow.
Have you heard this before?
Yeah, I had only this week. There's been so much coming out about Tim Walz's background on China, with connections with China, which, thank goodness, people are looking at this. I say, follow the money, follow the people's education. If you want to know what someone really stands for, don't just go by what is said in the media, because they're only going to tell you one layer of skin, the outer layer of skin. The inner layer of skin tells you so much. What you just said tells you exactly what is going on in their mind. Would you say that you wanted to get married on
Crystal knocked?
Right. Exactly. It's like that kind of association just immediately. I mean, I don't know Tim Walz, but anyone who wants to have their marriage associated with mass murder of innocent students, mostly youths, I question I question a lot of things about them. So I was shocked when I saw that. But I'm really glad that more people are actually paying attention to these things, because a few years ago people weren't even considering China. And to your point on the government position with China, I think there's people like Tim Walz who, anyone who's been taken for 30 trips to China is likely not just a fellow traveler, but to use a communist term, a useful idiot. I'm not saying he's an idiot. Look, I don't know the guy, but that's the term the communists use for people who they take advantage of and that they know they can buy them. If you've got a price on your head, you're a useful idiot, period. It doesn't matter who you are or how many degrees and how smart you are or how good your suit is. Doesn't matter. And above them, you have the strategists. And I would argue that even during the Cold War that there was communist strategists within the US government. If you go back to the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, it only took about 2,000 Bolsheviks to take over the entire country, and the country is just absolutely massive. But they had funding from Wall Street. If you look at Anthony Sutton's book and researching, it's all there. So we have the America.
I'm sorry, Kay. You're stimulating a lot of thoughts on me. And I see a little passion coming out of you when we get to this subject right here. The whole idea of a Russian revolution is Russian propaganda. It was a coup d'état. by a small, dedicated, radical, armed and organized group. That's what it was. It was a coup d'etat. There was no Russian Revolution whatsoever. And as it relates to Tim Walz, I saw this first on Twitter, and I thought, I don't believe this. Guy chose Tiana. I mean, come on. Nobody gets married on that date. I thought this is, because there's smears from both the left and the
Of
right.
course. Of
And
course.
I often tell people, and as a conservative, as a Christian, I often say to people, for instance, on something like, say, the World Economic Forum. I've been to the World Economic Forum. I've sat and listened to these people as they talk about global, overpopulation and the desire to reduce the global population by 6 billion. Why just sit and bite my lip and pretend to be one of them? And I'm listening to them talk about this, and then I will see some meme on social media that will say that Heinrich Himmler was Klaus Schwab's father. And I always say, you don't have to make stuff up about these people. You actually undermine your argument. Who they are and what they're saying is damning enough. Focus on that. Focus on the reality. And that's what I thought was the case when I saw this about getting married, on the anniversary of Tiananmen Square. I thought, this is not true. And lo and behold, it is true. And it is astonishing to me.
Yeah, if I had seen it on Twitter, I would have probably had a similar reaction to you. But I heard it on a very credible podcast, and by a China researcher, and who his work hasn't really been faulted. So I was able to, I think that was Peter Schweizer actually, and when they were running through the list of connections, it's the context that matters, isn't it? On Twitter, anything can be taken out of context. You see that one post, and if you're a critical thinker, you'll say, I don't know about that, because that's completely decontextualized in this tiny little feed of just, a big soup of letters floating through the internet. But when I had the context of listening to a program that was specifically on Tim Walz's background and connections with China, so I was more open to accepting. Did I go back and fact check every fact that I took from that podcast? Well, no, I didn't. And I'm hoping that, it's going to come out in a book and there'll be plenty of footnotes and I can go through and check it that way. But I do think it's so important to check and get that context, like you're saying, because things will be planted too intentionally to undermine the truth intentionally and distract us, so that the media or anyone else can point and say, well, you promoted that really ridiculous thing as a fact, so I just don't believe what you're saying now. That, crying wolf, how many times you can do that. I
Got to be careful.
Yeah, I put out a movie in 2015 called Hard to Believe, and that was about one of the worst crimes I believe, under the Chinese Communist Party, killing innocent prisoners for the sale of their organs, forced organ harvesting. At that time, this was 10 years ago. At that time, no one. It was hard to believe, and it still is hard to believe.
And I think many Westerners don't believe it.
Well, and that's fair enough, because they're kind and they don't want to believe that those things are happening. But now there's so much evidence that it's undeniable, and those who deny it either have a ulterior motive, a second layer of skin, or they haven't looked at the evidence. And those who have looked at the evidence have all changed their mind, because even the US government is now passing laws to prevent people from getting transplants in China, because you can get a heart or a liver in 1 week. So, which is not only highly suspicious, but proven to be criminal. So, but at the time, these kind of things can be used to say, well, there's so many bad things that people are saying about China. It could be made up. And then we start to it really does take away from what you're saying, the facts. It takes away from the real crimes that are happening, whether it's forced depopulation or killing of people for the sale of their organs. It's really hard. I think part of the naivete is that it's very hard for good people to accept that there are people who we may have voted into power, or who we may have given a lot of respect and care for, who actually are intentionally trying to harm us. That's really hard. That's really hard to accept.
It is very hard to accept, and it appears that we're going deeper into that side of the pool. Your reaction, and we didn't discuss this ahead of time, I want to say that to the audience. Your reaction to Tim Walz' trips to China is exactly mine, because I had, I think I had mentioned this to you. I'd been in China one time. I was at Peking University, and during a lecture, I stated that Mao had killed 70 million of his own people. And boom, you could have heard a pin drop when I said it, but I felt that I needed to say it. It was within the context of a Q&A, and it was that the answer I would have given in the West, and I gave the same answer there, but I could feel my heart, pounding. And I thought, either I step to the plate here and I have the courage of my convictions, or I don't. And I stated that my own translator did not want to translate what I had said. And while I was receiving this lovely tour around the campus and so forth, they kept a physical distance rather, from me. It reminded me of a biblical scene of Dathan and Korah, where the Lord said to back away from their tents because the earth was going to swallow them up. And I thought, is the earth about to open up here? Because they're standing 10, 15 feet away from me now. They're definitely keeping their distance from me as it relates to this. But the point is, when I applied to go back to China later, I was banned. And I was told I could not come in unless I signed a document stating I would neither write nor say anything negative about China. And so when I see a guy as of 2016, according to this CBS article, had been in China no less than 30 times, there's no way that doesn't happen, and particularly a guy in his position in government and then as governor, unless they do see him, exactly as you put it, as a useful idiot. There's no way. And then you add to that the decision to get married on the anniversary of Tiananmen Square. He's not trying to remember that because he wants to remember that solemn occasion and wants to be reminded of the horrors of that. He's celebrating that. He's celebrating that tyranny. To me, it's just incredible that this isn't getting a lot more play in our media than it actually is.
Yeah, it really depends on which media you're looking at. Shows like yours that are looking on all sides of the of politics of society. We need more like that, because that's when you can get the full picture. But if you're picking sides and you're just staying in your bubble, that's all you're going to see, unfortunately. And I do find it offensive for someone to intentionally want to be married on such a to be connected to such a date. Personally, I feel uncomfortable by that, just knowing. But I've personally read the descriptions of the way that those 10,000 students were brutally killed, and I write that in my book, as you mentioned. But I think for someone to go to China. Like you didn't go back to China because you would have had to say that 2 + 2 = 5. That's how I see
Exactly.
it. Is that you didn't compromise and you didn't say, no, you said, no, 2 + 2 = 4, and I'm going to keep writing that. And if you don't like it and won't let me in, I won't come back. Kudos to you. I think that's fantastic, because you stood to your values of truth. I think that's very commendable. For someone who takes paid trips to China, you have a debt. They will hold you to that. It's very, very easy and very common for them to find plenty of ways to blackmail you later on after you've gone. Some people need that extra step when they're working with communist regimes, where the regimes will control them by planting things that will, or putting them in situations that will compromise them, that they can hold them by blackmail to not release to the public. But there's others that they can simply buy. And I don't know which one Tim Walz is. Some people really want communism. They will complain about say rights for it's funny that there's a double standard. And I think if we talk about this more, if more shows are talking about this like you do, then people can start using their brains and questioning the double standard and not being afraid, because the communists use this tactic to try and make us think that we're stupid and that we are not as smart as them, and that we need this intellectual strategist class to control us, that which really undermines the whole independence and constitution here in America. So if we can really get back to more of the, and I think more people, there still are people where we've got a long way to go, but people are leading the charge. If we can get back more to the roots of what really makes America and the nation great, and Americans great, then we can get more to the root of how to defend ourselves mentally from socialism and communism, because that's what it's coming down to now. And in China, there's a controlled state, there's a border, but the Communist Party has spread beyond those borders, and it's even pushing propaganda and infiltration and attacks here on American soil. So I think we are needing, when if they control people like Tim Walz or others in government, then we need to have our facts straight, and we need to be able to stand true to our convictions, because they'll do everything they can to tell us that we're too stupid and that we need someone much smarter than them with more degrees. But it's usually those people that are the ones that the communists target first. They target them through the institutions. They use the artists and the intellectuals to promise them power and rank and money, and then they'll do whatever they say. Unfortunately, in China, there's this other term, you may not have got to it in my book yet, towards the end. It's called, it's another awful term. They have so many awful terms. I'm just telling you what they told me. It's called a dog intellectual. I don't know the Chinese word for it, but that's the literal translation. And in China, that's what they did. They took over the intellectual class, and these dog intellectuals, they are used to bite whoever the government says to bite, and they'll attack however they want to attack, and they don't value truth. Yes, exactly. And it just we're a bit too kind with calling them out. We need to get more clear on these things.
Do you happen to know what year your grandmother was born?
Off the top of my head, not the exact year, but they escaped around 1920, and she would have been, I think, about 5. So,
okay,
yeah, it was all
I was
very
just
early
curious.
1900. Yeah.
Okay, so I was just trying to place maybe what years she might have lived through and what memories that she might have had. Of course, for those listening, the Bolshevik Revolution was in October of 1970, actually November by our calendars, because the Russians operated off of the old Julian calendar at that time rather than the Gregorian calendar in the West. But she would have had certainly had plenty of generational memory, both of the Tsarist regime and then Lenin and much that followed afterwards. I've done a number of interviews with people in places like Russia, the old Soviet Union, but also survivors of the Holocaust. And the kinds of things that you're describing are very real. A man who had survived Siberian exile couldn't see a Caucasian sheepdog, which is what they used in the camps. These enormous, not German shepherds, much bigger than German shepherds, but lose his bowels. Whenever he would see one after he was a free man. This is just absolutely terrifying, because those dogs were terrifying in the way that they were used in the camps, and other people, perhaps a certain kind of music or accent or the associations are strong. And the point that you're making about how the Chinese could use those both positively and negatively to make you feel very warm in your heart about the Chinese Communist Party, which is actually your oppressor, is fascinating to me. Are there things that your parents, let's say, or your grandmother saw developing in the West, and I include Australia, within the West, it's Western culture, if not geographically, that they were alarmed by or are alarmed by?
Yes. None of them are alive now to speak of it. And I regret that I wasn't wasn't aware enough as a teenager to ask these questions. I was limited by language. My grandparents on both sides had limited English, and one set of grandparents was living in another state, so I didn't see them too often. But they're all passed now, including both my parents. So it just there's regret if you don't find out when you have the chance. And I do have regret that I didn't. My father wasn't able to read my book before he passed, and I would have loved that, because I would have loved to have added who knows what more I could have added, because he spoke the language
Mm.
so much more fluently than I did, and with his mother, who but what did they see? She warned us. She tried to warn us, and I think so many people just weren't willing to listen. In the 50s and the 60s, there was so many people trying to raise awareness about the communist plans to run through the institution, the long march through the institutions in the West. We see it here in America, and people say to me today, "Oh, I'm concerned about how far left or communist the educational institutions or colleges are in the US these days." And I told them, look back. I've been talking about this for 20 years. And there's others well before me who were talking about this 30, 40 years ago. They knew it because it's all documented. And I've read first, translations of speeches from Soviet Russia in the 1920s and 30s, where they laid out their plans of how they would try how they would accomplish what they're trying to do. And that was their plans. And we're seeing the fruits, the dark fruits of that now. My grandma certainly did try to remind us of that, but she found a lot of hope in faith. And that's what she really did instill in me, that no matter how oppressive a tyrannical regime or government is, there's still someone higher than them. And that has always given me a lot of hope. And I found that, and so have others who have interviewed people who have suffered brainwashing and torture, is that they usually there needs to be faith in something, whether it's God or whether it's a government or something. There's usually, you need to have faith in something bigger than yourself, but also you need someone in the world that's worth living for. So having strong family ties always seems to be a key to survival for people who haven't been broken through torture and brainwashing. So these are kind of values that my grandmother instilled in me without specifically saying, this is how you survive brainwashing and torture in the future, because these things, just in case. She didn't say that. She always just emphasized developing and strengthening family relations and one's faith. So I can thank her for that, for sure.
Was she Russian Orthodox?
Yes.
Okay, I mean, it would stand to reason that she was, but doesn't mean necessarily that she was. And then there were those of the old believers. I don't suppose she was one of the old believers,
Oh,
was she?
yes. They were definitely
Okay, she
old
was.
believers. Yeah.
Yes, okay, and they really fell afoul of the regime. I mean, hundreds of thousands of them were persecuted, arrested, murdered, and so it makes very good sense that her parents would choose to leave the country and that she would manage to escape that. Now, you going to China, what made you decide to go there? Had you been there before you started this particular project?
No, I hadn't. I hadn't done too much international travel before that. I was 19, so I was pretty young, and I was naive. Absolutely, my father, as I said earlier, was born and raised in China for 14 years, who had seen communism take over and ruin a country firsthand. I told him I was going to be a human rights advocate on Tiananmen Square and hold a banner, and he was horrified. And he said I was naive. Was he right? Absolutely. I mean, you can read a lot of articles, you can read some books, you can watch videos. The internet wasn't what it was back then, right? Compared to what it is now. So I didn't have access to all the information that we have right now. I didn't realize how censored and how in a bubble the Chinese people are. And so much of that I learned afterwards. And it's really hard to imagine how someone else can live in such a completely different mental, social environment to what I have. It's just too easy for us to think that we all think this. We forget, and we think everyone thinks the same as us. And when they don't, we think they're weird. Well, that's weird in itself, because everyone is so unique, and every culture is really so unique. So anyway, I went to China. Was a rude awakening for me. I knew that the Chinese Communist Party didn't want anyone holding banners on Tiananmen Square that said truth, compassion, and tolerance. They were the three words. I was particularly holding the word compassion, but those were the three words that still are a massive taboo in China. And my goodness, the night before I went to this, I went to Tiananmen Square to hold this banner. I went to a restaurant, and I'd been going there with my friend who I traveled with for a few nights. It was a great dumpling place near our hotel, and we became friends with the owner. And so he came and took photos with us, and we ate dumplings together, and he was trying to learn English. We were learning Chinese. And on the last night, I thought, I want to tell him why I'm here. And I was worried, would he send me to prison? Because he could. Anyone who is advocating for those words in China, those words specifically are the principles of the Falun Gong, Falun Dafa spiritual meditation, that's been heavily persecuted for the last 25 years. And at the time, it was still a new persecution. And I didn't know what would happen, but I thought I really felt I should tell him why I'm here. So I gave him a card with those three words written in Chinese on it as we were leaving the restaurant that night. And his face, oh my goodness, completely dropped. He was in absolute shock, and he started shaking. And he held the card. He was holding it, and he's looking at me, and he's looking back at the card, and he's like, that is the fear. It's crazy, isn't it? That is the fear that the Communist Party has instilled in the populace through their nonstop media control through the whole nation for nonstop daily. So he was so afraid of those three words. He didn't know what to do. And he looked at me, and I'm smiling, and I'm saying, I know what this is. And he knew I was in Beijing. That's the place where people go to appeal for human rights. It's your last resort in the country. So he was very scared, and he didn't know what to do with his card, because he knew that could land him in prison for having those three words. But what did he do? He folded it in half, and he slipped it inside his apron pocket. Really, it was close to his. I felt it was close to his heart. I really appreciated that. And then he followed us out of the restaurant. He could have got on the phone and called the police immediately, and I would have been arrested that moment. But he didn't. He watched us walk down the road safely to our hotel. And that was a brave man. Just to accept that was a brave man under that oppressive regime in China. Can you imagine that in America? It's ridiculous. It's a stupid story. You try and think about that in America, it's stupid. No one would get it. They would say, well, that's just dumb. But in China, think again. It's a whole nother world. And when you tell those little stories, then people realize, like, oh, when you say there's hundreds of thousands of people languishing in torturous conditions in prison camps in China right now, they say, yeah, we know, that's all boring. Yeah, we're sick and tired of hearing that. We know that. We still buy our cheap stuff from China. But when you tell a story like that, which is what I tried to do in my book, is bring out these real human stories, just so you can relate to us as fellow human beings and the people in my book, then that's why I was so naive in China, because I really was thinking, like so many Americans, that China's like us. But it's not. Any country that has had the communist regime ruling it for certainly multiple decades, it is a completely different world, and it's really hard to imagine.
Yeah, Americans cannot relate to these things. They try, at least many of them do, and sometimes a movie recommendation or something is helpful in communicating some of the feeling and some of the issues that are involved. But for the most part, I find that Americans, it's almost like something that Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, that unfortunately it seems that every generation has to experience the evils of communism themselves, of Marxism, of socialism themselves, for them to really understand, because they don't listen to, or maybe even if they did, they really couldn't comprehend the truth, the reality of that. Like your your father telling you you're naive. Naive doesn't even quite capture it. I mean, Americans, Westerners in general, but Americans especially, are charmingly naive. My wife sometimes will lament. She will say, I feel like I'm a very naive person. And I always say, Lori, that's to your credit. It's because you're not so jaded by the world and so suspicious. She will feel that way in an instance where maybe somebody's taking advantage of her. And I say, but the alternative is to go through life just cynical and jaded and suspicious of absolutely everybody and everything. And maybe you never get taken advantage of. And if you're that sort of person, but who wants that? I don't want to be married to that. So, Americans are a bit like that. And I was in a conversation yesterday, Kay, with someone who had said, in fact, it was a result of a social media post by a German who it was kind of going viral, his observations about Americans. And he said, Americans are very loud. That was one. And then another thing he said is that it's bling everywhere, that they show off, their wealth. And it was stated in such a way as to, somewhat condescendingly. And I thought, this is a guy who doesn't really understand his own country or even indeed the history of his own continent to understand why Americans are that way. Americans are used to their wide open spaces and their big cars and their big houses, and they're used to being generally dealing with people who are going to treat them like they matter and in a way that's friendly. And so we, anytime I'm in Europe or indeed in Asia or Africa, I always say, the guidebooks tell people Americans try to blend in. And I say, there's no hope for you. I don't care if you're a black man in Africa, you are not going to blend in. They can tell immediately. And it is because not just simply the way we dress, even if you were to nail that, and we won't, we carry ourselves in a very open way, don't we? Our heads are up. We hold eye contact with strangers as they pass. We maybe say hello. We maybe ask people how they're doing, whether we know them or not. And this is all part of our kind of naive history. Whereas Europeans, I have, for instance, French and Dutch friends who will tell you the bling thing in America has to do with the fact that your tax laws aren't like our laws. We as French, we give a very austere look to our homes unless you're really, really, really wealthy. And then we hide our wealth from within because ours is a culture of envy that is a result of socialism. And your neighbor will call the tax man on you. And because the assumption is that if you're wealthy, you've stolen it. And whereas in America, we celebrate people's success. We don't look at Elon Musk and think he's not doing his fair share. We go, wow, that's the American dream. I mean, would you agree with that?
I love that description, Larry. I think it's really fair. And coming from Australia and having traveled to multiple countries as well, in Australia.
For a moment, pardon me, I was assuming you were an American there. I forgot, but yes, go ahead.
Well, I've been living in America for 15 years now. And some Americans say to me, oh, New York, a New Yorker, they don't like that necessarily. But what I love about America is all the things that you said. But when I was moving here for work, my family were worried. They said, you might become like an American. Do you really want that? I said what do you mean? What do you mean by that? And again, I'm stubborn. I need to see it for myself. My dad said, well, you become big and loud like an American. And I said, well, let's see. And so in Australia, in most countries in the world, we're taught to love Coca-Cola, watch Hollywood movies, eat McDonald's, but we're taught to hate America, and we're taught to look down on Americans, and we're taught to consider them selfish. And if you trace that back, the roots back, it's exactly what you're saying with what you see, what you described in Europe. It is an intentional narrative that's been propagated through the world to make people look down on Americans. And unfortunately, too many Americans are buying it. And it's not true. When I moved to America, actually before I moved to America, I was coming here periodically for conferences and for work. And when there was one time I came with my son when he was 11 months old. I was in New York City, and every time I was here for 6 weeks, and every time I got to a stairwell for a subway, I just thought, oh my goodness, how am I going to get down there? Because sometimes they're narrow, they're dark, they're dank, and sometimes there wouldn't be anybody around. Every single time. There was not a single time where someone just didn't materialize out of nowhere and help me down those stairs. I didn't have to ask for it. And I was shocked. And then I go back to Australia. A few weeks later, I'm traveling to the city. I had my son with me and, young working mom, and my son came with me everywhere. And so we were going to the city, and I had him, and I had the baby pram, and I had my bags and everything. And there's a big train station and wide stairs and lots of people going up and down. And I thought, maybe someone will help me up. I'll see if someone will help me up the stairs. Very long staircase. And no. And I thought, well, I'll start. I'll pack everything up and maybe someone will help me up halfway because there's a platform halfway. Not a single person. And I could do it. I survived. I'm here. I survived a bit of hardship getting up the stairs. I'm okay. But the big difference in America is that looking out for each other. And that is also what I noticed in the school system. My daughter started kindergarten here, and she went through the whole public school system here. And wow, the way there was one poster on a wall the first time I went into an American kindergarten, and I saw a poster on the wall, and it had photos, black and white photos of 4 presidents, American presidents, and it said everything that listed things that they failed at. This president failed at this. This one failed at that. This one failed at this, failed at that. And the point was they were saying, but look how they succeeded. You're going to fail. You're going to fail at something, but you'll succeed. Just don't give up. And that's the kind of character that I wanted my kids to have. And that's why I wanted to stay here, and I wanted them to go through the American school system as opposed to the Australian school system, which is a little bit closer to Europe in that a culture of envy. And but here I just felt a lot more freedom, and that my kids could be more independent, critical thinkers here. So there's that duality of what I mentioned of socialism and communism heading through the long march through the institutions, but there is still the American spirit here, which I love. And I think it's often misconstrued intentionally to make people think that it's a negative. And it's just because they don't understand, but also they don't realize that there is a intentional narrative there trying to push down America on a global scale. So that's something we really, but why don't we know about this? You mentioned movies earlier there hasn't, maybe there's movies. Hollywood, has Hollywood ever done a movie about the Tiananmen Square massacre in China? 1989, 10,000 students. That is the official number that came from a British consulate member.
Yeah, I was startled by that number in your book and the description of what was done with the bodies. In fact, quoted it in a tweet. I had never heard that information before, and my background is in studying socialism and Marxism and communist history. So that was data that was new to me.
And those documents are all it's very well documented, and they were declassified not too long ago. That's why we hadn't heard of it earlier. And I was lucky that it had been released not too many years prior to me publishing my book. So I was able to put it in there, including the documents, photos of the documents themselves. So think about that. 10,000 people get mowed down in a public square in any country. There's usually going to be a movie about that. Not in Hollywood. There are very few, if any, movies where China is the bad guy in Hollywood. It's usually that any script writers who do that have to rewrite it. Otherwise, they lose access to the Chinese market, and they need to put North Korea or someone else or some, unknown entity as the bad guy. They do not
Some
want
vague Nazis. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's why we have in the school system, we know about the evils of Nazism. We know about the evils of the Holocaust. I remember seeing photos of that, and I have a sense. If I had had a sense of the evils of the number of deaths in 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre or the Cultural Revolution in China, maybe I would have been more hesitant to go to China. But I hadn't seen that. I had no visual concept of it, only some warnings and from people. I couldn't imagine it. But our school hasn't been teaching the evils of communism because there's never been any Nuremberg trials for it, has there? So and there's no Hollywood movies about it because the largest communist regime in power is controlling a lot of pocketbook ties for big institutions in America like Hollywood. And so that's why we're not getting access to the information that actually would really help us to take a good look at ourselves and understand, what American culture really is and where it sits on a global playing field. I think that's really important.
Yeah, I agree with that. And Kay, as an American born and raised in this country and a child of the military, I grew up with that, very much with that ethos. And my father had fought in 2 wars against Marxists, we were taught in high school and in university the evils of communism. We were taught all of that. And somewhere along the way, that narrative changed. And I think that it became Russia rather than, let's say, communism or Marxism or socialism. And with the collapse of the Soviet Union, I remember, and I've said this on this show a number of times, so my listeners, hopefully they'll be patient in hearing me say this again. But I was in graduate school studying Russian, Eastern European Marxism, history. And I remember when the Soviet Union collapsed, and I remember my advisor saying, "Go to law school. This is dead. This ideology is dead." And the phrase, you may remember this, Kay. I think you're a little younger than I am, but you may remember this phrase, ash heap of history, or the trash heap of history, is what was said of communism, of Marxism. And with less wisdom than I actually possessed, it was just that I was midstream and I thought, what? I just now throw away 6 years of education and now move in a different direction. I said, well, there's still a billion Chinese on the other side of the planet who, so far as I know, haven't yet given up on this ideology. And I think there's still a looming specter. So I decided to continue on. And what do you know? Here we are in the West, where we are seeing all of this. And I've seen this movie before, as it were, and we're seeing it in ways that are quite startling in the West. I just finished, I told you before you came on, I was doing an interview with a colleague of mine who's a well-known British actor. His name's Lawrence Fox. And Lawrence is very active politically, but Lawrence is facing some very difficult situation there where now you can be arrested in his home city of London for a meme. I mean, a meme, just because the regime doesn't like what you're saying. Americans still, now some of them do, some of them get this, but most Americans still cannot relate to this. And this shadow, this black cloud is beginning to roll over our country. I want you to listen to this quotation. Now, this is from the CEO of NPR in a TED Talk. I want you to hear this quotation, and then I want your reaction to it.
Our reverence for the truth might be a distraction that's getting in the way of finding common ground and getting things done.
Kay, what is your reaction to a statement, as an astonishing statement like this from, again, the CEO, the head of NPR, the state news organization?
I'm sorry, I'm laughing. It's just so ridiculous, isn't it? Where we're at now. I've heard that. I did watch that, and previously, well, I say one laugh, better to laugh than cry. I mean, that is so George Orwell, 1984, isn't it? Where people are having to say, 2 + 2 = 5. And I guess because, like yourself, I've been studying this for so long that you start to develop. I start to become a bit desensitized to some of these things, and I have to remind myself, not everyone thinks the same as me, and they don't have the same experience as me, and they have different knowledge and experience. So I need to really respect that and try and help people understand what those things are. I mean, truth is something that we have taken for granted, and when you do, you just cannot take anything for granted these days. What we think is going to be everlasting is being tested, and really. But if you look back at the communist ideology, and there's a chapter in my book about propaganda and the 2 layers of skin. I interviewed a propaganda official, and
and that's what led me to play that for you, is because this is where I'm going. So please continue.
Right. So with the Chinese example, the Chinese Communist Party example, I found it really fascinating that this propaganda official who I interviewed, and I interviewed many people who worked for the propaganda department, because most journalists in China actually are working for the propaganda department in some form or other, often officially in China.
As we go through life, the years bring us wisdom, experience, and memories we hold dear. Yet with age, our health often faces new challenges. It's a natural part of life, but it's crucial to address these changes with the right care and attention. For me, one of the ways to stay sharp is to supplement. I've been using Liver Health Formula, and I recommend you try it for yourself to see the results that it can bring. And right now, I think is the time to start taking care of your liver, because there is a silent epidemic affecting 100 million Americans. 1 in 3 Americans suffer from an overworked and sluggish liver. It affects our weight, energy levels, clear thinking and productivity, and even sleep. Our livers get bombed every day with GMOs, microplastics, toxins, and all of the stuff that you might not even know about. Liver Health Formula can support your liver to minimize the impacts of all of this. It is a premium supplement designed with 11 clinically proven botanicals to support and detoxify your liver, helping you feel revitalized and ready to conquer each day. Just listen to Mr. Harrington's testimonial, who shared his transformative journey. At first, I was skeptical, but the health improvement has been nothing but amazing. The tired, foggy feeling I've had is gone. I have more energy for a longer duration. Also, the service and delivery is always prompt. Of course, results are not typical, thus you have to see for yourself. There's an exclusive deal for my audience. Head to getliverhelp.com/Larry. And as a special offer, you'll get a free 1-month supply of nano-powered omega-3s with your order. That's getliverhelp.com/Larry.
There's this concept of 2 layers of skin, and it's where your outer layer does not reflect the inner layer. So the inner layer is the truth. There is truth. They acknowledge that there is truth. But on the surface, you have to project something that is not truth, and you have to justify it. So, for example, the Chinese Communist Party will say, we are no longer we no longer have slave labor prison camps. Okay, our detention centers are all being shut down. Okay, so they will write that in their articles. But internally, they change the names and they call them drug rehabilitation centers. They're run by the same people. They're the same facilities. They carry out the same tasks. They have the same budgets. They are in the same locations. They do the same things. They are the same thing, but you change the name and you tell everybody it's something new and you expect them to buy it. So this propaganda official he had to understand, and it was hard for him at the time. When he was in it, he had to just do it. You do your job. He didn't want to lose his job. But it was really later on that he started to understand what his superior had enforced with him, that you must have 2 layers of skin, and you keep your internal layer to yourself. You do not tell that to anybody, because that's the truth. You can't tell people the truth. You need to give the party line. And if the party line is like what the NPR representative is saying is consensus, that's a great word. Great word. Love it. Everyone can say, I want consensus. Great. Yeah, let's say consensus. What does that mean? You must lie. I don't like that. Well, then we won't say that. We won't say that. That's the inner layer of skin. You keep that to yourself. But the consensus we like, because we can put that on posters, we can write it in our emails. It becomes all the marketing terminology, and we blast it out there, and the media will repeat it. We'll push it through the schools. But it's a lie, because we have to say that truth doesn't exist, and that truth doesn't matter, which means, right, where does that lead you when you say truth doesn't matter? Like when they told me in China, I said, why did you arrest me? And the police said, well, what you did was illegal. And I said, truth, compassion, tolerance is illegal? They said, yes, it's illegal in China. They told me point blank, truth, compassion, tolerance is illegal in China. Under communism, truth does not matter. It doesn't matter, because they don't treat human beings as human beings. That's the ultimate, isn't it? With communism, with socialism, it's a very atheistic view, in a very negative sense, that human beings are dispensable, disposable, utilitarian, and that
You're just the raw material for the building of the state. Well, you anticipated exactly where I was going with this, because you discuss in that chapter at length the issue of truth and how they treat truth. And you quote, I think, Lenin as saying that, truth is scarce, therefore we must ration it, which is, meant to be a cynically humorous remark, but it's not that funny when you realize they mean it, and that they believe they should have exclusivity of truth. And it's why communist regimes have such antipathy for the Christian faith in particular. And that's because Christians are, by their very nature, they're rebels insofar as they don't acknowledge the laws of the state as ultimately supreme. They see laws. I mean, the United States was founded on that very idea. I mean, the British laws, whatever they were, the founders of this country said, but there are laws above those laws, which say that each of us are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit. I mean, those are beautiful, beautiful words. I remember an Indian scholar saying to me, Kay, some years ago, that only a naive Westerner would write something like the Declaration of Independence. And I said, how so? What do you mean? And he said, well, in India, we assume that people are not created equal. Well, our whole society is predicated on the notion of inequality.
Yeah.
And he says, so to us, it's beautifully, charmingly naive that a Westerner would pen words that say it's self-evident that human beings are created equal. He says, because that is only true if you assume that people, because there are massive intellectual, spiritual, economic, physical inequalities. So the only way that could be true is if you believe there was spiritual equality. And the only way that's true is if we believe there's a God, a Christian God. And he said, so for someone to pen words like that and just assume that everyone accepts that notion, he says, is a beautiful notion. But he says it's one that argument could never carry in a place like India, or for that matter, a place like China.
Well, I don't know enough about Indian beliefs to comment on. I know about the society.
I'm just speaking of China.
Yes, but with China, they have a long history of beliefs, and it is a very spiritual nation. So I mean, under communism, things get wiped out, like what would happen with my grandparents and the old Russian culture in Russia. It was very spiritual based. That the Julian calendar that my family still use for church dates and things
No
like that
kidding. That's
as old
interesting.
believers. Absolutely. I mean, my stepmom still uses that it's on the
That is
wall.
fascinating.
It's on the wall. So there are still old believers around the world, and so that hasn't been wiped out. And I love that. And in China too, I love that there are so many people who haven't wiped out their spirituality. Though it's hard. It's hard, but I think there's a renaissance. And I like to see that. I like to see that in different parts of society where people are getting back to having a value on valuing each other as human beings. And that's something that in many cultures, certainly in the Russian culture and in the Chinese culture, they value human beings as being created by a creator, however you describe him or her, or the being, however. There is that inherent value in life, and that life is precious. And we've come so far where in so many societies where the law as written by human beings becomes primary, or science as decided by human beings becomes primary, perhaps even religious to many people. And it becomes their God, what everything is decided on. Things like morality, virtue, courage, those kind of more intangible aspects that are very much tied into Christian faith and the traditional Chinese faiths and the Russian Orthodox faith. Those things are, well, they're not taught in schools, and they're in most schools. So I think a lot of those intangibles we've kind of are looked down upon as naive or superstitious. But when you really strip back, why did he say that it was so beautiful? I think because everyone resonates with it. Everyone wants to be respected. Everyone wants to respect life, and those who don't. I mean, look at the terrible situations that we have now with the rising suicide rates and the rising drug addiction rates and overdose rates. I attribute a lot of that to people feeling meaningless in their life. And there's many factors, of course, that go to that. But when you don't have meaning, certainly communism and socialism wants people to not have meaning in life and want them to follow whatever the state says. Let the state give them meaning, give them purpose, give them
And
credit.
define truth.
And define truth. Absolutely. That's what it all comes back to.
Yeah, and that's the thing here with the attacks on religion, specifically on the Christian faith, because the state wants to be supreme and defining what truth is, and that's a part of your book where, as it relates to the two skins, as it relates to propaganda, that the state will determine what the truth is, and therefore, if the state says 2 + 2 is 5, you will accept that as being the case. And it seems to me that in recent years in the West, certainly in the United States and in Western Europe, COVID-19 felt a little bit like a bit of a dry run as it relates to some of these things, because you did have dissenters who, and I'm not making any commentary here on vaccines. I have no knowledge of vaccines. I do not position myself as an expert in that at all. However, I found myself talking to scientists, very thoughtful scientists, highly educated scientists, who did not want to go on record because they knew there would be recriminations, who were early on raising a lot of questions, not just about the vaccines themselves, but the methodologies that were being employed. And that, for me, as somebody, because I had kind of grown up with I'd had lots of vaccines, of course. I had been vaccinated for all sorts of things. When I was doing a project for the book that sits right down here, around the world in more than 80 days, I was going to 35 countries, and I had to go to the University of Alabama travel clinic, where they shot me with all kinds of, this type of rabies shot and that type of rabies shot, and you name it, I was getting. I didn't really question any of that. And then suddenly I find myself several years hence we're at the front end of the whole COVID thing, and I'm interviewing scientists both in Europe and the United States who have some serious reservations about the things that are going on, and their primary concern dealt with the science itself in this sense, that what has happened to the notion that in a university we can question these things and have reasonable discussion, and where my science is compared to your science, and where there are absolutes that determine the outcomes of these questions, that's gone. It's just simply not there anymore. And now we have the head of NPR who is so arrogant, astonishingly arrogant, so confident that she can come right out and state truth is an inconvenience to progress. And to me, her remarks could have been written by the Chinese Communist Party. Startling stuff.
And perhaps they were. If you look at the college level education, the data shows that most professors lean heavy to the left, and they've moved further and further to a hard left over the years. And so a lot of the youths coming out from the college systems are already being trained to think of truth as relative and subjective. That's what I was experiencing when I was in college, and I found it strange and uncomfortable. But I couldn't put my finger on or describe what it was at the time, or I couldn't see the roots of it. And so that's been something I've wanted to get to, and I have, but that's not something that's being taught in the school system. So the next generations, we're seeing in China, we've seen what it's like to have a complete society overrun by controlled. I use the term parasite, which is an awful term, and I actually don't like it at all. But it's the most accurate term that was actually given to me by insiders from the Chinese Communist Party when they described the operations of how the Communist Party works. And even inside a hospital, for example, you have multiple departments. You have the liver department, the heart department, each different health department. There is a Communist Party representative office for the hospital, but there's also one for each individual department. And what do? They're not functionally helping patients. They are controlling the party line of the workers. And so it's not adding in a functional way, in a practical way to society as we would expect when you have extra people in a workplace, but they are maintaining the party line. So in China, I like to say it's the best example of the worst case scenario that we can learn from. And you can start to see some parallels here. And when you look at China and see how far they have come under 70 years, that's a long time under communist rule, then we can start to understand why some people are really buying that line or pushing that line of truth being unnecessary or relative. Then you can start to see, oh, that's part of the communist spectre. That's not necessarily that person's own personal failing. It actually they've just got hooked on that spectre and or they've been duped. So then when you start to follow those threads, you can start to see there's actually bigger strategies at play that have been carried out for about 100 years now. They have a really long-term plan and long-term goals, these strategists that have been, at least from what I'm aware of, at least since the Soviet times. And they're very active in China, and they have strong roots in America as well. And they're going to be testing all of us as to, are we going to say that 2 + 2 = 4, or are we going to say that 2 + 2 = 5? And if you give in to that concession and say, all right, 2 + 2 is 5, just give me a break, okay? Well, you can go anywhere from there.
Exactly.
So that's where we're at.
Well, and I was looking for a particular quotation that you reminded me of. But as it relates to this issue, I think Americans are, again, we've talked about being naive, and part of that naive aspect, I have argued, naivete has characterized American foreign policy for most of the 20th century. And it's because we operated, for instance, during the Cold War, it took some very hard lessons for Americans begin to understand even just a little bit of the communist mindset that they were dealing with in Russia, say, or in with the Chinese or the North Koreans or the North Vietnamese, because Americans operated from the basic assumption that human beings are basically good, that they all want the same things. And you find yourself saying to politicians and to people like that who are going into these settings and dealing with people like this, you need to understand and by the way, I find myself having similar conversations with people going into Islamic countries, Islamic contexts, where I'm saying you need to understand that they don't operate from the same assumptions that you. It's not to say there aren't some people within those countries, but when you're dealing with the higher ups, as a rule, that is not what you're dealing with. It is not the way they think. And a weakness is seen as something to be exploited. And you don't think like that. It's not a part of who you are as an American, as a human being, but you need to listen to what I'm trying to tell you, because otherwise you're going to get hurt or you're going to get other people hurt. And now we're starting to see some of this, penetrating our government. And one of the more jarring things that you said in your book is, and you just said it here just a moment again, is that the head of NPR may have been quoting the Chinese. I mean, that there is a program to penetrate our institutions. Yeah, I'm in total agreement with you. I only want to keep you just a couple of more minutes, Kay. I know you're a busy woman and you've got a lot going on. Do you spend much time on social media?
I try to limit my time, but I'm on there.
Well, you're wise to do that. I have noticed on Twitter these beautifully slick videos that are they get hundreds of thousands, millions of views that are being circulated by accounts with anonymous names, and they try to give the appearance they have nothing to do with China. Okay, that is to say that the accounts themselves don't originate in China, and it will be always of the wonders of China. It's not a single account. There are several of these, and Americans, Westerners will give it millions of likes because they're beautiful videos, and it'll be something like how Chinese school children learn to count, and it will be something very amazing, and it'll say, "Why don't we do this in the West?" And you'll go, "Oh wow, look at this! It's so incredibly organized and wonderful." Or a Chinese waterfall, and then it's amazing. Or a Chinese city, or a Chinese train, and it all looks space age. And I find myself sometimes retweeting them and saying, "China's a third world country." Shanghai is an astonishing city. There's no doubt about that. Shanghai makes any city in the West look third world, at least the city center does. But I always say to people, you must understand that comes at a price. There are no civil, it's a wonderful place to live if you don't fall afoul of the law. And the law is what the Chinese Communist Party decides. And if you do, you're done for. That's it. And I was in Geneva recently. I don't know if I told you this off air or not, but it bears repeating. And I noticed all these kids in the lobby of my hotel. They were there for the CERN superconductor. And these were high school kids. And I noticed that they were all using English. They weren't speaking Chinese, even just themselves. Among themselves, they're speaking English. And I'd seen them several days in a row, and they seemed friendly enough. And so I'm sitting there drinking a cup of coffee, and I say, "So tell me, where are you from?" And they tell me that they're from Beijing. And I say, "I can't help but notice that you're all speaking to each other in English." And they said, yes. We're told that we're to use English this entire trip. We're supposed to practice it. And their instructor hears me, Kay. And he comes over, but he's not Chinese. He is a Westerner he is their instructor in Beijing at this institution, the Science Academy, and both for his technical skill and because of his English skills, and that he can teach them the ways of the West. So he comes over and he begins to manage this, and he says, "Yes, students, please sit down, sit down." So he instructs them to sit on the chairs and the couches, around me. And they said, "Speak to the gentleman, use your English, tell him, about your experiences and what you're doing." And they were typical high school kids. Okay. I mean, they could have been from Louisiana or New York. But then, just as a test, I said, "What do you think of China's social credit system?" It was just like when I had said that Mao killed 70 million of his own people. Total silence, eyes darting from one another.
Yeah.
Their instructor looks slightly panicked. And I said, "They're not supposed to answer that question, are they?" And he said, "No, they probably shouldn't." And then he starts to answer it. And I interrupted him, Kay, and I said, "You probably better not answer it either." And he said, "Yes, thank you."
Yeah.
And they got up and they left. And I relate the story. These things would not be foreign to you at all, but that's what tyranny looks like. Yeah. And that's what Westerners can't understand. What warning would you give to the people who are listening from your experiences? And it's not just your experience in China, but you've got generational experiences coming down to you from your parents and grandparents who lived through these things. What warning would you give to our audience?
Well, I think my hero, one of my heroes is Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who you've quoted earlier, and I think he's everything about communism has been said. There's nothing new that I can say that really hasn't been said before. I'm just a fresh face and a news story to tell. There is nothing new about communism that hasn't been said before. All the lies, all of the truths about it, all the crimes of it have all been written, well documented. All you have to do is look and remember. That's all it is. Don't think that this is new information. If you haven't heard this information, you are behind the times and you better catch up. Everything has been written for decades. It's just about time you paid attention. And I think with China, the biggest takeaway for me, and that I think it's vital for everyone to remember, is China is not the Communist Party. The Chinese people is not the Communist Party. But in China, there is a confusion. There is a mental confusion because these people are within these confines constantly under the barrage of the Chinese Communist Party media. They equate all of that as one big blob, that if you are criticizing the Chinese Communist Party, which I do, they say that you are anti-China or anti-Chinese, and I am not. So to me, that is to tell me that, to say that 2 + 2 is 5. No, Chinese people are wonderful. They're wonderful human beings, just like Americans. Different culture, different background, wonderful. Love them all, no problem. I love the Chinese videos of the beautiful waterfalls and the beautiful landscape, isn't it? It's just fantastic. China before communism, I mean, is amazing. But the Chinese Communist Party is a devastation, and the Communist Party has devastated every single culture that it has impacted. Every single culture. There is not a single example where it hasn't. And we have 100 years of documentation to prove it. If you have any doubts, just open your eyes to history. And the biggest criticism that people who speak out against the Chinese Communist Party get is that they're anti-Chinese, which is the biggest slap in the face to any, especially a Chinese person who's trying to raise awareness about the truth to certainly to Chinese people in China, to help them say, you guys are brainwashed. Open your eyes. They killed people on Tiananmen Square. It's not what we were taught in school. They're called traitors. And people like me are called anti-Chinese, which is just the biggest ridiculous statement when we're actually helping the Chinese people. We're helping humanity. And it's only the Chinese Communist Party that is equating. It's like saying Americans are the Democratic Party because the party is in power. it sounds ridiculous, right? Because it is, but in China, it's a whole nother world. So I think we need to remember those things, and just remember that communism is exactly what you thought it was. That's what it is. It hasn't changed. Maybe we're using new technology now. Yes, we've got the social credit system and all this new tech. Communism itself is still exactly the same. And I'd love you to go and read my book, Who Are China's Walking Dead? But you can read a lot of great books about communism too, but learn more stories. The facts haven't changed. And that's what we're looking at. If you want to look at what could happen here, look to China. It's the best example of the worst that could happen. So that's what my book and movies are about.
Well, and I would encourage anyone to read your book. And it's been a pleasure having you on. Who Are China's Walking Dead? You can find it on Amazon, probably other fine retailers. And Kay Rubacek, it's been a delight talking to you. You've offered us some real insight. Thank you very much. Love to have you on some other time.
Oh, thanks, Larry. Really appreciate it. You too.
This has been Ideas Have Consequences with me, Larry Alex Taunton.